In 1845, the island of Ireland held 8.5 million people. Today, 180 years later, it holds around 7 million. Ireland is the only country in Europe with fewer people now than it had then. Almost every other nation on Earth has doubled, tripled, quadrupled since. Ireland never recovered. And the reason is not a war, not a plague, not a conquering empire. The reason is a vegetable. One crop failed one time, and a nation emptied out. Roughly 1 million dead, well over 1 million gone on ships, and a population that kept falling for a full century afterward. But the story doesn't start in Ireland. It starts 8,000 years earlier and 4,000 meters above sea level, on a freezing plateau in the Andes Mountains of South America, where the most important vegetable in human history was born in the one place on Earth where plants are not supposed to grow at all. The potato was born where farming should be impossible. The high Andes of Peru and Bolivia sit at 3,000 to 4,000 meters above the sea. Thin air, brutal sun, and nights that fall below freezing more than 200 times a year. Wheat fails there. Corn struggles below the passes. And yet, roughly 8,000 years ago, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, mountain farmers did something remarkable with a small, bitter, poisonous tuber. Wild potatoes are laced with natural toxins, defensive chemicals strong enough to sicken a grown adult. Generation by generation, those farmers selected the least bitter plants, replanted them, and slowly bred the poison out of the flesh. It may be the greatest feat of plant engineering in the ancient world, and it was accomplished without writing, without iron, and without the wheel. By the time the Inca Empire rose in the 15th century, the Andes held not one potato, but thousands of distinct varieties: red, purple, yellow, black, knobbled and smooth, bred for every altitude, every slope, every soil. And the mountain peoples had already solved a problem Europe would not solve for centuries: storage. On freezing nights, they spread their harvest on the open ground, let the frost pierce it, then stamped the moisture out underfoot through the warm day. Around 5 nights of this produced chuño, say it, chuño, a freeze-dried potato so durable that, by most accounts, it could be stored for 10 years or more. It was, in effect, the world's first freeze-dried food, invented roughly 5 centuries before the machinery that now feeds astronauts. The Inca state ran on it. Imperial storehouses called colcas lined the mountainsides in their thousands, stacked with chuño to feed armies, road builders, and entire provinces through drought years. Spanish observers later reckoned that some of these networks could provision an army for years at a time. An empire of roughly 10 million people, stretched along 4,000 mountain kilometers, marched on the potato. Then, in the 1530s, the Spanish arrived and looked straight past it. They had come for treasure, and in the silver mountain of Potosi, they found more of it than any empire in history. The potato they dismissed as laborers' food, useful mainly for feeding the miners cheaply, the fuel of the very silver boom they celebrated. But ships need provisions, and tubers travel well. A cargo record from the Canary Islands dated 1567 holds the first documented shipment of potatoes toward Europe, and by 1573, hospital ledgers in Seville show potatoes being bought to feed the sick. The most important food transfer in human history had begun, not with a ceremony, but with a line in a receipt book. Europe now held the plant that would remake it. It had no idea what it was holding, and for the next 200 years, it would treat the gift with open disgust. To understand what happened next, remember what Europe was. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, famine was not a catastrophe there. It was a schedule. France, among the richest kingdoms on earth, suffered nationwide famines by the dozen in the 1700s, and local ones by the hundred. When grain failed, people died, predictably, repeatedly, in every generation, in numbers that dwarf most wars. Into this permanently hungry continent came a plant that produced 2 to 4 times more food per acre than wheat, grew in soils grain rejected, and matured in a few months. And Europe's answer, almost everywhere, was absolutely not. The potato had 3 problems. It belonged to the nightshade family, cousin to plants every herbalist knew could kill a man. It grew underground, pale and lumpy, which struck refined opinion as vaguely indecent. And it appeared nowhere in the Bible, which for many clergymen settled the question permanently. Physicians blamed it for leprosy and fevers. In parts of Russia, villagers called potatoes the devil's apples and refused them for another century. In France, its cultivation was for a time legally restricted. Across much of the continent, it was considered fit mainly for pigs and prisoners. A civilization that buried famine victims by the 100,000 spent 200 years refusing the cure, growing quietly in its botanical gardens. Breaking that resistance took kings, wars, and one brilliant showman. In Prussia, Frederick the Great issued his famous Potato Order of 1756, commanding peasants to plant the crop against famine, and, the story goes, posted guards around royal potato fields, correctly betting that anything worth guarding would be worth stealing. In France, the campaign had a name: Antoine Augustin Parmentier. Say it, Parmentier, a young army pharmacist captured by the Prussians during the 7 Years' War and fed little in prison but potatoes. He walked out healthy and made the despised vegetable his life's cause. In 1772, prompted by his work, the Paris Faculty of Medicine formally declared the potato safe to eat. He staged all-potato publicity dinners for the famous, by most accounts, Benjamin Franklin himself sat through one. And in 1786, he planted a plot at Sablons outside Paris, guarded conspicuously by soldiers through the day and, by most accounts, left deliberately unguarded at night, so that curious Parisians would steal his seed potatoes and plant them as contraband. It worked. Legend adds that he persuaded Queen Marie Antoinette to wear potato blossoms in her hair, a story stronger in spirit than in paperwork, though the court fashion for the flower was real enough. Within a single generation, the potato traveled from pig trough to peasant table across northern Europe, Irish cottages, German villages, the Russian plain. And then the numbers began to move. Wherever the potato took hold, the death rate bent downward, and the birth curve bent up, quietly, district by district. The plant, Europe had feared as poison, was about to become the hidden engine of the most explosive century of growth in the continent's history. And, in one country, the single point of failure for an entire nation. The 1800s belonged to the potato, and the evidence is written in the population tables. In 1700, Europe held roughly 120 million people. By 1900, it held more than 400 million, the fastest sustained growth the continent had ever recorded. When economists finally traced that explosion region by region, comparing the districts that could grow potatoes against the districts that could not, they reached a conclusion that still sounds impossible. By most estimates, the potato alone accounts for roughly a quarter of the Old World's population growth across those 2 centuries. One vegetable, a quarter of the boom, tens of millions of human beings who exist because of a root Europe once fed to pigs. The mechanics were brutally simple. An acre of potatoes could feed a family that an acre of wheat could not, nearly 3 times the calories from the same ground. The crop thrived in soil grain rejected, from Norwegian valleys to alpine slopes, and it hid underground. This mattered more than it sounds. When armies marched, And in that century, armies marched constantly. They could torch a season of wheat in an afternoon, but they could not easily destroy a crop buried in the earth. Peasants noticed whose food survived each war, and after every major conflict of the era, potato acreage jumped again. Cheap, secure calories then rearranged society itself. When fewer hands were needed to feed a nation, hands went instead to looms, mills, and mines. It is barely an exaggeration to say that the workforce of the Industrial Revolution was raised on potatoes. The crop shows up in wage records, in army recruitment ledgers, even in the measured heights of conscripts, which rose with the potato and fell where it failed. Nowhere on earth did the potato conquer as completely as Ireland. The island's cool, damp climate suited it perfectly. Its poverty made the decision for people. Under the landlord system, Irish tenant families raised grain and cattle to pay rent on land they did not own, and much of that grain left the island for sale, while the family itself lived from the potato patch behind the cabin. On a single acre of poor ground, a laboring man could raise enough potatoes to feed a family of 6 for most of a year. Taken with buttermilk, it was, strange as it sounds, a genuinely nourishing diet. By some studies, the Irish rural poor stood taller than the bread-fed English poor of the same decades. By the 1840s, out of 8.5 million people, roughly 3 million depended on the potato almost entirely, and a working man might eat 12 to 14 pounds of them in a single day, not as a side dish, as breakfast, dinner, and supper, as the diet. And inside that triumph sat a flaw that nobody alive could see. Irish fields had come to be dominated by one high-yielding variety, the lumper, and potatoes are not raised from seed, but from cuttings. Every lumper in Ireland was a clone of every other. Genetically speaking, the food supply of 3 million people was one single plant, copied across 1 million acres. Whatever could kill one of them could kill every one of them, in the same season, everywhere at once. No such killer had ever appeared. In 2 centuries of European cultivation, the potato had earned a reputation as the one crop that did not fail. That was the entire foundation of its empire, which is precisely why nobody was watching the water. In the summer of 1845, somewhere in the holds of ships crossing from the Americas, a microscopic organism was already traveling east, and the number it was about to carve into Ireland is the same impossible number this video opened with. We are almost there. The organism was Phytophthora infestans, say it Phytophthora infestans, a water mold whose Latin name translates, fittingly, as the plant destroyer. It had crossed from the Americas, and in the wet summer of 1845, it found Ireland, cool, soaked, and planted end to end with a single clone. The spores moved on the wind and the rain, and a healthy green field could rot to black slime in under a week. That autumn, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Ireland's crop failed. The next year, 1846, was worse. The blight took almost everything. Then came the winter of 1847, remembered simply as Black 47, the deadliest of them all. Here is the fact that turns a crop failure into a crime. Throughout the famine, Ireland kept exporting food. Ships left Irish ports loaded with grain, cattle, butter, and eggs, guarded, in some seasons, by soldiers, bound for English markets, because that produce was the rent, and the rent was law. The potato that fed the people had died. The wheat that paid the landlord sailed on. The government in London, gripped by the free market doctrine of the day, chose for long stretches not to interfere, insisting the market would correct itself. It did not. Relief came late, tangled in rules, and often demanded brutal labor on public works from people already starving. One assistant to a Cork magistrate left a report that still stops the reader cold. In December 1846, Nicholas Cummins walked into the village of Skibbereen and found, in a single hovel, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, one of them a dead man, huddled in the corner on filthy straw, their only covering a ragged horsecloth, and above them a low moan of the still living. He wrote it down and sent it to the Duke of Wellington and to the Times of London, so that no one could later say they had not been told. They had been told. The dying went on. Hunger was only the beginning. The weakened died in far greater numbers from what followed: typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever, what the Irish simply called famine fever. Whole families took to the roads, some walking to ports, some walking simply to walk, dropping in ditches where later travelers found them. Soup kitchens, when they finally came, at one point fed roughly 3 million people a day, proof the scale of the hunger was fully known even as the food kept sailing. Landlords, seeing tenants who could no longer pay, tore the roofs off cabins to be rid of them. The tumbled stone footings of those evicted homes still sit in Irish fields today, a century and a half later. When the counting was done, by most estimates, around 1 million people were dead, out of 8.5 million. Proportionally, as if a modern nation lost 1/8 of everyone alive. That is the number the title of this video carries, and the number the record delivers. But death was only half of what the blight did to Ireland. The other half left on ships, and it never came back. And here, the story splits in two, because the same blight that emptied Ireland forced the rest of the world to fight back, and that fight rebuilt the modern potato. The immediate consequence was human, and it was permanent. Over the decade of the famine and the years around it, well over 1 million people left Ireland. By most counts, more than 1.5 million emigrated, packed into the crowded, disease-ridden vessels that came to be called coffin ships. They landed in Boston, New York, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Toronto, often meeting signs that no Irish need apply, and taking the lowest paid, most dangerous work the new cities offered. Today, tens of millions of people across the world descend from that flight. The Irish presidency, American police forces, Australian towns, and Boston itself were reshaped by a water mold that killed a plant. A single failed harvest scattered a nation across 3 continents, and the scattering never reversed. The demographic wound stayed open for 100 years. Ireland's population kept falling until the 1960s, the only country in Europe of which that is true. While Ireland bled, the laboratories went to work. The blight had exposed the fatal weakness of the clone, and it drove one of the first great campaigns of modern plant science. For decades, the mold outran every remedy, until, in the 1880s, a French botanist named Pierre-Marie Alexis Millardet, M.E.R.D., noticed something in the vineyards near Bordeaux. Grape growers had been splashing their vines with a nasty blue-green mixture of copper sulfate and lime purely to stop passers-by stealing the fruit, and those sprayed vines, he saw, were free of a mildew ravaging the rest. He tested it on potatoes. He spent years testing it deliberately. It worked. The Bordeaux mixture, discovered essentially by accident around 1885, became the first effective agricultural fungicide in history, and it is still in use on farms today, nearly 140 years later. Then, in the 20th century, breeders did the deeper work, venturing back to the Andes, to the thousands of varieties the Inca had bred, to pull disease-resistant genes out of the potato's ancient homeland and cross them into modern crops. The mountain gene pool that Europe had ignored for 300 years became the reservoir that saved the plant. The lesson of the clone had been written in 1 million graves, and this time, slowly, it was learned. Never again would a single variety be allowed to carry an entire nation. The monoculture that built the Irish catastrophe became the textbook warning that modern agriculture is still, imperfectly, trying to obey. The potato that came out the far side of that century was tougher, more varied, and spread wider than ever. It was ready to do something no crop had done before: feed the entire planet. Today, the potato is the third most important food crop on the planet, behind only rice and wheat. The world grows something on the order of 370 million tons of it every year, across roughly 150 countries, on every inhabited continent, from the Andes that bred it to fields north of the Arctic Circle. And the center of that empire has moved. To picture the sheer quantity, 370 million tons is heavy enough that, loaded onto trucks, the convoy would circle the planet many times over, every single year, and rising. The largest potato producer on Earth is no longer Europe or the Americas. It is China, followed closely by India, with the two of them together growing roughly a third of the world total. The crop the Andes gave the world has circled all the way back to feeding the two most populous nations in human history. Consider one number that would have stunned every king who ever banned this plant. In the 1990s, when China set out to feed its enormous population more securely, it turned deliberately to the potato as a strategic food, and a plant once dismissed as fit for pigs became a pillar of national policy for a fifth of humanity. In 1845, it was the food of the poorest cabins in Ireland. Within a century and a half, it was a matter of state security for the largest nation on Earth. The potato had one more frontier left. In 1995, aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, potato plants flowered and formed tiny tubers in orbit, the first food ever grown in space, chosen precisely because the crop that had survived the Andes could survive almost anywhere. The tuber, bred on a freezing plateau 8,000 years ago, had become the first candidate to feed humans on other worlds. From Lake Titicaca to low Earth orbit, the same modest route. It is a strange kind of immortality for a plant Europe spent 2 centuries calling the devil's apple. The experiment was led by plant researcher Raymond Buhler and his team, working with the University of Wisconsin, the names behind the first flower ever to bloom into food beyond the Earth. And yet the oldest lesson has not fully expired. Modern agriculture still leans on a small handful of commercial potato varieties, grown across vast areas, defended by chemical sprays against descendants of the very mold that took Ireland, an organism that keeps evolving to break through. Scientists who study crop security still point to the Irish fields of 1845 as the clearest warning humanity has ever received about betting a food supply on a single plant. The graves made the point. The question is only whether we keep remembering it. So let us count what this one plant did. It built an empire in the Andes and fed the miners who filled Spain's treasure fleets. It doubled a continent and put a quarter of Europe's new millions on the earth. It fed the workers who built the modern industrial world. And then, in one country, on one wet summer, it killed roughly 1 million people and drove half again as many across the oceans, reshaping Ireland, Britain, and America in a single decade. It fed astronauts, and it now feeds China. One root did all of that. The potato is the quiet argument against judging anything by its surface. Europe looked at a lumpy brown tuber and saw poverty, poison, and sin, and spent 200 years being wrong, while the answer to its oldest terror, hunger, sat ignored in its own gardens. When Europe finally bent down and picked it up, the plant repaid the debt many times over, and then, once, collected a debt of its own so terrible that a nation has not refilled its cabins in 180 years. Both of those are the same plant. The one that saved millions and the one that starved millions are not two potatoes. They are one, made dangerous not by the root, but by the decision to stake everything on a single version of it, and to let a hungry people go on exporting food. The blight only pulled the trigger. The gun had been loaded, deliberately, for decades. That is the whole strange history of the potato, the poison that became a staple, the peasant food that toppled famine, the single crop that emptied an island. And right now, somewhere in your kitchen, it is almost certainly sitting in a bag, the cheapest, most ordinary thing on the shelf, the most extraordinary vegetable ever grown. And before you go, here is the question I want your answer to. If you had lived in 1700 and a stranger handed you a lumpy brown root and swore it would save your family from starving, would you have trusted it or thrown it to the pigs like everyone else did? Tell me below.